Thank you, Mr. Lazarus. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I'll start out with a comment in that the United States, for far too long, both Republican and Democrat administrations have not paid close enough attention to what's happening in our own hemisphere, and it's allowed China to make the inroads that it has. And now we're just waking up to the fact. And so this hearing is part of that, to try to awaken the American people and the administration to the fact that we need to pay close attention to what's happening in our own neighborhood. And so with that, this is an open question. It's my estimation that the Cuban regime itself is actually in one of the most weakest positions that it has been in the past 60 years. Do any of you share that opinion, or do you disagree with that opinion? I'll start with you, Dr. Berg.
Thanks for the question, Chairman. I do share that opinion. I think the Cuban regime is incredibly weak at this point in time, and we've seen that not just in protests from the island, but in rolling blackouts that occur seemingly on a monthly basis, sometimes weekly basis, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Fernandez, Mr. Fernandez.
Yes, I agree. I think economically, politically as well, the Cuban regime is in a period of vulnerability. I think also increasingly hemispheric as well as U.S. Political consensus is moving towards a recognition of the malign nature of the Cuban dictatorship, as past attempts, however, poorly conceived at engagement, as we have seen from the U.S., have fallen flatly and been rebuffed, and the Cuban dictatorship has, at the same time, again, as we have discussed, acted as an active partner for enemies of the United States within our hemisphere.
Mr. Lazarus, do you share that opinion that the Cuban regime is at one of the weakest points in the last 60 years?
Sir, I'd absolutely agree. Inflation is almost 30% for the Cuban regime. There's been an increased outflow of refugees coming out of Cuba, and there's been an increase in Cuban officials traveling to Beijing, trying to get more investment. I understand that now China is Cuba's either largest or second largest trading partner, accounting for roughly 30% of Cuba's imports and exports. So I think that Cuba's decreasing economic situation is allowing it to become even more and more dependent economically and increasingly security and political standpoint on China.
I'd like to discuss you with the three of you offline and how we can accelerate the dictatorship, their demise, so we can turn Cuba from a platform and a base for China and make it actually a friend of the United States. And I think we're close to that. I also think that Cuba is the head of the snake. When we talk about all the unrest that's happening in our hemisphere in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba's the head of the snake. And we need to do everything in our power to set the Cuban people free, but also turn Cuba from an enemy into a friend. Now, let's talk about Cuba and the threat and the Chinese threat in Cuba. The Russians have been operating there for years, decades. Are the Chinese supplanting the Russians, or are they adding to the Russian threat?
I'm happy to take that, Mr. Chairman. I think that they're both supplanting, but also adding to. There's still a residual Russian presence, of course, in Cuba. We saw last year at the tail end of the Biden administration how the Russians sailed a vessel through the Florida Strait, ported both in Cuba and in Havana. Importantly, before porting in Cuba, displayed one of its Zircon hypersonic missiles in the Atlantic. But I would say in terms of the presence, Mr. Chairman, the Chinese have supplanted them in terms of the more important partner. And quite literally, some of these sites that we've showed were former Russian sites that are now occupied, we believe, by the Chinese.
And they've added to the capabilities, more modern infrastructure, et cetera.
That's correct.
Okay, and so maybe some of my colleagues would be surprised to know that not only is it Russia and China, but also Iran is here, and North Korea is also here, and so we need to also stand up to those threats. The training range that's just outside of Florida, it's the largest training range that we have. It's the only training range that actually can simulate battle in the Taiwan Straits. What kind of a threat do these facilities pose to those ranges, and what kind of intelligence could the Chinese get from surveying those ranges in relation to our tactics, et cetera, of how we may operate in the Taiwan Straits?
Mr. Chairman, the first slide that I showed in my presentation showed just the number of facilities in your home state that are easily within range of these facilities. It's my understanding that military communications is, of course, encrypted and protected in certain ways. But if it's scooped up by some of this equipment, then it is available for the Chinese to try to crack that communication. And so that's why one of my recommendations is doing an exercise to harden facilities and figure out what our vulnerabilities are, so that we can make sure that we protect those very vulnerable secrets, both on the commercial side and on the military side, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. My 5 minutes are up, and I recognize